In the heart of the Arkansas Delta, the fertile land of Phillips County stretched for miles, blanketed in endless rows of cotton. For generations, this soil had been both a source of life and a symbol of bondage. By the early 20th century, the Civil War was long over, but for many African Americans in this region, true freedom had yet to arrive. They worked as sharecroppers, toiling from sunrise to sunset in fields they did not own, bound by debts they could never repay. The system was designed to keep them trapped, their labor enriching the white landowners who controlled nearly every aspect of their lives. Under the shadow of Jim Crow laws, these men and women faced not only economic exploitation but also legal and political disenfranchisement. They could not vote. They could not challenge unfair wages or dishonest accounting. The plantation stores, owned by the same landlords, sold supplies at inflated prices, ensuring that year after year, the workers ended each season with nothing left to claim. Life was a constant cycle of labor, debt, and silent endurance. But the land held more than just cotton. It held resentment, ambition, and the unyielding hope for something better. Across the United States, winds of change were stirring. It was 1919, a year that would later be called the Red Summer, because of the wave of racial violence that swept the nation. Black veterans were returning from World War I with a new determination to claim the rights they had fought for overseas. Labor unions were gaining strength, and in places like Phillips County, whispers of organization began to ripple through the fields. In small gatherings and church meetings, sharecroppers began to speak openly about fairness, about demanding the payment they were owed, and standing together to protect one another from exploitation. It was a dangerous conversation to have. White landowners viewed any form of black organization as a threat not only to their profits, but to the social order that had long placed them in power. Still, hope was stronger than fear. Farmers joined the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, determined to push back against the cycle of poverty and injustice. They believed that unity could give them a voice loud enough to be heard and perhaps, finally, respected. Yet, in a world where racial tension simmered just beneath the surface, even a peaceful meeting could spark a deadly chain of events. In the fall of 1919, a single night would shatter the fragile balance in Phillips County and ignite one of the darkest chapters in American history. What began as a conversation about fair wages would spiral into chaos, leaving the field stained not with the white fluff of cotton, but with blood. Before we uncover the events that turned this small farming community into a battlefield, take a moment to support our mission of sharing untold histories. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who value learning the stories that history tried to erase. Your support helps us bring these voices back into the light. Life for black sharecroppers in Phillips County was a carefully constructed trap. A system that looked like opportunity from a distance but was, in truth, a set of invisible chains. After the Civil War, freedom had been promised. But here in the Arkansas Delta, freedom was an illusion. The fertile soil was still rich with cotton, and the same white landowners who had once relied on enslaved labor now depended on a new form of control: the sharecropping system. On paper, it seemed fair. Black families would work the land, and in return, they would receive a share of the harvest. But in reality, every rule of the game was written to keep them from ever winning. The cycle began each season when sharecroppers needed seeds, tools, and other essentials to plant their crops. There was only one place to get these supplies: the plantation store, owned by the same landowners who controlled the fields. The prices were inflated far above what anyone in town might pay elsewhere, and the goods were often of poor quality. The workers had no choice but to buy on credit, signing their names or making their mark in ledgers they could not read. Interest rates were punishing, ensuring that by the time the cotton was harvested, the debt had already grown like weeds in the field. When the crops were finally picked and bundled, the landowners dictated when and how they would be sold. The market might be offering a high price for cotton that year, but sharecroppers rarely saw those profits. Instead, they were told the value of their crop by the very people who bought it from them, a value always far below what it was worth. The difference lined the pockets of the plantation owners while the workers' debts to the store remained untouched. Or worse, grew larger. Settlement Day, when accounts were tallied, was a moment many feared more than welcomed. Landowners rarely provided itemized statements, and for most sharecroppers, who could not read or write, there was no way to challenge the numbers. Year after year, families who had labored through blistering summers and backbreaking harvests would be told they still owed money. They might not receive a single penny in payment. Instead, they were reminded of the balance they had to clear before they could ever think of leaving the land. It was an unspoken rule in the cotton country that a sharecropper could not walk away until every cent of debt was repaid. The debts, of course, were designed to never be fully repaid. This kept families tied to the same plantations for generations, their lives bound as tightly as the cotton bales they carried to market. If anyone dared to challenge the system, they risked more than just losing their place to live. They could face violence, intimidation, or worse. Beyond the fields, the laws reinforced this economic trap. Jim Crow segregation made sure that political power remained firmly in white hands. Voting restrictions such as poll taxes and literacy tests were crafted to exclude black citizens, stripping them of any means to influence the rules that govern their lives. Without the vote, there was no hope of changing the system from within. Without fair pay, there was no hope of escaping it from without. Still, the human spirit is stubborn. Even under such crushing conditions, hope found ways to take root. Sharecroppers began to talk quietly among themselves about fairness, about the injustice of working so hard only to see their labor vanish into someone else's ledger. The war overseas had changed the thinking of many. Black soldiers had fought in Europe for principles of freedom and democracy. And when they returned home, they carried with them a new determination not to accept the same old oppression. They saw through the lies of the sharecropping system, recognizing it for what it was, another form of control, one that wore the mask of legality. The Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America became a vessel for this determination. It offered a rare sense of unity, a belief that by standing together, sharecroppers could demand honest accounting, fair prices for their crops, and payment in cash rather than in vague promises or more debt. Meetings were held in churches, often at night, when the day's work was finally done and prying eyes were less likely to interfere. Yet, those eyes were always watching. To the landowners, the union represented a direct challenge to the system that had kept them in power for decades. To them, the talk of fair pay and honest dealings was dangerous, not because it was untrue, but because it was true, and truth could be a spark in a field dry with resentment. In the summer of 1919, tensions were already high across the nation. The Red Summer saw racial violence erupt in cities from Chicago to Washington, sealed by economic competition, post-war unrest, and the unspoken fear among many whites that black Americans were no longer willing to remain silent. In Phillips County, the tension in the air was almost tangible. Every whisper of union activity, every rumor of organization among the black sharecroppers, seemed to bring the threat of confrontation closer. As autumn approached, the cycle of debt and underpayment was once again tightening its grip on the community. Many sharecroppers had not yet been paid for the cotton they sold the previous year. The debts to the plantation stores had grown so heavy that they could barely imagine a way out. And yet, they still imagined it. That hope, fragile as it was enough to bring them together, to share plans, to place their trust in the idea that unity could break the chains. But those who benefited from the system were not about to watch it be dismantled. In their eyes, The demands of the sharecroppers were not calls for justice, but threats to their authority. It was in this charged atmosphere that a single meeting, meant to discuss fair payment, would be twisted into an excuse for violence. The story of that night, and the days that followed, would become one of the most tragic and revealing episodes in America's long history of racial injustice, a story written in the blood of those who had dared to ask for nothing more than the fair value of their labor. In the years following the end of the Civil War, the promise of freedom for millions of formerly enslaved people seemed within reach. Yet that hope was quietly eroded by a network of laws and social systems designed to keep them from having a true voice in their communities. Among the most insidious were measures like poll taxes and deliberately complex registration rules, both crafted under the guise of election integrity, but in reality serving a far more calculated purpose. These measures were not mere inconveniences. They were obstacles meant to ensure that the ballot box remained closed to most black citizens, and even to many poor white farmers who might have allied with them politically. In towns across the South, election days became less about civic participation and more about quiet exclusion, where the legal system itself acted as the gatekeeper to democracy. For many, the process began with a long journey to the courthouse, often requiring time away from work they could not afford to lose. Once there, prospective voters faced a set of hurdles that were impossible for most to clear. The poll tax demanded a payment that, though seemingly small to wealthier citizens, represented a crushing expense for sharecroppers and laborers already trapped in cycles of debt. Even if a man or woman managed to save enough to pay, the challenges did not end there. They would be met with literacy tests or so-called understanding clauses, which required them to interpret obscure passages of state constitutions. These were not genuine assessments of a person's ability to read or think. They were subjective traps, designed so the officials overseeing the process, almost always white and politically aligned with those in power, could arbitrarily fail anyone they wished. The impact on black communities was profound. In counties where freedmen had once stood in lines to vote during Reconstruction, the number of registered black voters plummeted within a single generation. Entire communities found themselves without political representation, their voices silenced in decisions that determined school funding, land use, and the enforcement of laws. The disenfranchisement was not only a matter of numbers but of morale when year after year the doors to participation were slammed shut. Many stopped trying altogether, worn down by the futility. And yet, the system's cruelty extended even further. For poor white farmers, who in some cases shared the same economic struggles as their black neighbors, these laws also served as a barrier. This was intentional. For those in power feared that shared hardship might forge alliances that could threaten the political order, by ensuring that both groups remained divided and disenfranchised. The ruling elite could maintain control without fear of an uprising at the polls. In many towns, the law was reinforced by an unspoken code of intimidation. Black residents who tried to register were often met not just with bureaucratic roadblocks but with subtle threats to their livelihoods and safety. A sharecropper who pushed too hard might find his credit at the local store revoked, his cotton undervalued at market, or his family's lease abruptly terminated. Even when violence was not openly used, the economic consequences were enough to keep most from making repeated attempts. The courthouse itself became a symbol of exclusion, a place where hope for change turned into quiet resignation. Generations grew up under these conditions, learning from their parents and grandparents that the system was stacked against them. Stories of the Reconstruction era, when black men held office and helped shape laws, became distant memories, spoken about in private but rarely with the expectation that such a time could return soon. Children in these communities understood early that the rules were not written for them, and that opportunities to shape their own futures would be limited not by their abilities but by the invisible walls of legislation. Still, resistance simmered beneath the surface. Churches and community gatherings became spaces where strategies were quietly discussed. where elders passed down knowledge about loopholes and legal challenges. Some managed to register despite the odds, often at great personal risk, and their courage served as a reminder that the right to vote, though obstructed, was still worth fighting for. But these victories were rare, and the broader system remained largely intact for decades, ensuring that power stayed concentrated in the hands of those who had built it to protect their own interests. By removing the ability to vote, the ruling class effectively removed the ability to demand change. Schools in black neighborhoods remained underfunded. Infrastructure improvements bypassed their streets, and laws that disproportionately punished them went unchallenged. It was a cycle designed to perpetuate itself. Without the vote, there was no power to elect leaders who might dismantle the barriers. And without dismantling the barriers, there was no path to reclaim the vote. This was not an accidental flaw in the democratic system, it was its deliberate manipulation. Laws like poll taxes and complex registration rules did not merely reduce participation. They redefined the political landscape for generations, ensuring that equality on paper did not translate to equality in practice. And while history would eventually bring moments of progress and reform, the scars of this exclusion ran deep, shaping the political and social realities of communities long after the laws themselves were overturned. It was a reminder that freedom, once denied, is not easily restored, and that the tools of disenfranchisement can be as effective as any chain or shackle, binding people not with iron but with rules and procedures designed to keep them powerless. In the oppressive heat of the Arkansas summer, a quiet determination began to stir among the tenant farmers and sharecroppers who had long labored in the cotton fields without seeing a fair return for their sweat and toil. Generations had bent over the rows of white fiber under a sun that seemed merciless, their backs etching and hands worn from picking. Yet when the time came to settle accounts, the plantation owners' ledgers always told the same story. There was never enough to pay what was owed. This was the cycle, a cruel arithmetic that kept families in perpetual debt, working land they did not own for promises that never came true. But something in the air was changing, and whispers began to spread between neighbors, across kitchen tables, and in the dim light of cabins where oil lamps cast long shadows on the walls. The idea was simple but powerful. What if they organized? What if, together, they demanded the wages they had earned and the working conditions they deserved? From this shared frustration and hope was born the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. It was not the creation of some distant politician or outsider. It came from the farmers themselves, the people who knew the rhythm of planting and harvest better than anyone. Men and women who had seen their fathers and mothers live under the same unjust system decided they would not let their children inherit it without a fight. The union was more than just a name, it was a lifeline. A declaration that they would stand together against those who profited from their silence. Meetings were held in secret, away from the eyes of those who would see their unity as a threat. Sometimes in churches, other times in small schoolhouses or barns, members gathered to speak openly about the conditions they endured. The air in those meetings was electric, charged with both fear and hope. Voices that had been hesitant grew stronger as people realized they were not alone. They shared strategies for negotiating better pay, discussed how to ensure that workers received an honest count of the cotton they picked, and spoke of the possibility that their children might one day work under fair conditions. The union became not only a vehicle for economic justice, but also a source of dignity, a way to reclaim a sense of self-worth in a world that sought to diminish it. The plantation system had long thrived on isolation, keeping workers scattered, ensuring they had little contact with one another, and making it difficult for them to see their shared plight. The Progressive Farmers and Household Union shattered that isolation by uniting black tenant farmers and even some poor white laborers who faced similar exploitation. The union challenged the deep-seated belief that the powerful could divide workers along racial lines to maintain control. In doing, it laid the groundwork for a solidarity that was both radical and dangerous in the eyes of those who ruled the Delta's economy. Leaders of the Union were ordinary people elevated by the trust of their peers. Robert Lee Hill, a sharecropper himself, emerged as a key organizer. He understood the risks but believed that change was worth the danger. Traveling dusty backroads, Hill spoke to small gatherings, explaining the Union's mission and encouraging others to join. Each meeting, each whispered conversation, was a small act of defiance, a step toward a future in which labor was met with justice rather than exploitation. But the Union's growth did not go unnoticed. Landowners, accustomed to controlling every aspect of their workers' lives, saw the organization as a direct threat to their authority and profits. The very notion that those who had been silent for so long would now demand fair treatment was alarming to them. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, a quiet battle between those who sought dignity and those determined to maintain the old order. The members of the Union knew the risks. They had heard the stories of retaliation, jobs lost, homes burned, and worse, but the alternative, enduring the same injustices generation after generation, was no longer acceptable. As the Union gained strength, it also became a source of education. Members learned about their rights, about how to keep records of their labor and pay, and how to negotiate without being intimidated. Women played a crucial role, often managing household economies and understanding the weight of every cent earned or lost. They knew that fair payment was not just about survival, it was about breaking a cycle that had kept their families in poverty for decades. In the fields, the change was subtle but significant. Workers began to speak up when they believed they had been shorted in their pay. They questioned unfair deductions and demanded receipts. Even small acts of resistance, like keeping their own tally of cotton picked, signaled a shift in the balance of power. It was dangerous, but it was empowering. The Union had given them the courage to believe that they deserved better, and once that belief took root, it could not easily be erased. The Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America was, at its heart, a movement about more than wages or contracts. It was about recognition, about saying to the world, "We matter. Our work matters." It was about families sitting down at their tables with enough food to eat, children being able to go to school instead of the fields, and communities being able to plan for futures not bound by the same chains their parents wore. Though its members faced incredible odds, the Union represented a vision of equality that stood in stark contrast to the reality of the Delta, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed possible that this vision might take hold, that the cotton fields could one day be places of honest work and fair reward rather than symbols of endless hardship. Even as the storm clouds of opposition gathered on the horizon, the Union's very existence was proof that the spirit of resistance had not been extinguished, and that ordinary people, when united, could challenge even the most entrenched injustices. The end of World War I was meant to usher in a new era of peace. Yet for many Black Americans, the homecoming brought only new battles on familiar soil. Across the country, from small towns to sprawling cities, a wave of racial violence began to swell, ignited by deep-seated prejudice, economic competition, and the false narratives spread through newspapers and political speeches. Black veterans, having served their country in uniform and returned with a new sense of dignity, found themselves targeted by those unwilling to accept their elevated status or their demand for basic rights. Instead of parades and gratitude, they often faced threats, intimidation, and outright attacks. The summer of 1919 would become etched in history not for the joy of victory overseas, but for the bloodshed it witnessed at home. In many communities, the tension had been simmering for years. The migration of thousands of Black families from the rural South to northern and Midwestern cities brought both hope and hostility. These families sought better wages, safer neighborhoods, and the promise of equal opportunity. Yet their arrival was met with resentment by some white residents who feared job competition or social change. Newspapers and local politicians fanned the flames, publishing inflammatory headlines that painted black residents as outsiders or troublemakers. In reality, many were war heroes, laborers, and parents simply trying to build a better life. But in an atmosphere thick with mistrust and manipulation, truth mattered less than fear, and that fear soon erupted into violence. The first sparks often began with a single incident and accusation. An altercation, or a rumor whispered into the right ear and spread quickly. In Chicago, a black teenager swimming in Lake Michigan drifted across an invisible racial boundary and was met with stones hurled by a white mob. His death sparked days of unrest, as neighborhoods barricaded themselves and roving gangs clashed in the streets. In Washington, unfounded reports in the press inflamed white mobs to hunt down black citizens, while in cities like Omaha and Knoxville, false accusations escalated into riots that consumed entire districts. These were not isolated moments of chaos. They were interconnected by the same underlying forces, revealing how fragile the peace truly was. For the victims, these riots meant homes reduced to ash, livelihoods destroyed, and lives stolen without justice. Black communities bore the brunt of the devastation, yet they also displayed remarkable resilience. In some neighborhoods, veterans organized defense patrols, standing guard through the night to protect their families. Churches became safe havens, offering shelter to the displaced, while black newspapers reported the truth in defiance of the dominant narrative. Despite the overwhelming odds, these communities refused to be silenced or erased. Each act of survival was itself a form of resistance, a declaration that their existence would not be dictated by violence. The violence of 1919 was not confined to one corner of the nation. It rippled outward, touching over 36 cities and towns. The pattern was hauntingly similar. A rumor, an accusation, or a minor dispute would be amplified until mobs formed, often with little intervention from authorities. Law enforcement, when present, frequently turned a blind eye or even joined in the aggression. The federal government, despite being aware of the crisis, offered little meaningful protection, leaving black citizens to fend for themselves. For many, the bitter truth was inescapable. The war overseas had been fought in the name of democracy. Yet at home, that same democracy was glaringly incomplete. In the aftermath, the physical scars on cities were matched by the emotional and psychological wounds within black communities. Families mourned not only for their loved ones but for the loss of a fragile sense of security. Yet, the events of 1919 also planted seeds of determination. Leaders and everyday citizens alike recognized that change would not come by waiting for goodwill. It would require organized effort, relentless advocacy, and a willingness to confront injustice head-on. Organizations like the NAPE intensified their campaigns, while local community groups sought to educate, register voters, and challenge discriminatory laws. This period, though marked by grief, also revealed the unbreakable spirit of those who endured it. The violence had intended to intimidate and suppress, but instead, it fueled a stronger demand for equality. Stories of courage emerged alongside the tragedies, neighbors shielding one another from danger, young men and women risking their lives to smuggle food and aid into barricaded districts, families rebuilding from the ground up. These moments became quiet testaments to the resilience that oppression could not crush. The nationwide racial violence that followed World War I was more than a tragic chapter. It was a turning point. It laid bare the hypocrisy of a nation that championed freedom abroad while denying it at home. It exposed the dangerous power of propaganda and prejudice, as well as the systemic failures that allowed such violence to flourish unchecked. And perhaps most importantly, it solidified a truth that would echo throughout the coming decades. Progress would not be handed down, it had to be claimed. fought for, and defended by those who needed it most. As the 1920s dawned, America stood at a crossroads. The memory of the riots lingered, shaping conversations about race, justice, and the meaning of citizenship for the black veterans who had once marched proudly under the American flag. The struggle had shifted from the trenches of Europe to the streets of their own cities, and though the battle for equality was far from over, the events of 1919 had ensured that it would never again be waged in silence. It was a warm evening in the small Arkansas community of Hoop Spur, a place where black sharecroppers had gathered to discuss ways to protect their livelihoods and ensure they were paid fairly for the cotton they harvested. Many of these men and women had worked the land for years, often under exploitative contracts that left them in perpetual debt. On this particular night, a meeting of the local union had been called inside a simple wooden church, the walls lit dimly by oil lamp, the air heavy with the weight of their shared struggles. The room was filled with hushed but determined voices, discussing collective bargaining and legal support to challenge unfair treatment by landowners. Outside, however, another tension was brewing. In the nearby town, rumors had begun to circulate, distorted and inflamed, painting the gathering as something far more sinister than it truly was. To some white residents, the idea of black laborers organizing themselves was seen not as an act of self-preservation, but as a threat to the established order. Fueled by fear and mistrust, a small group of armed white men decided to confront the meeting. They set out under the cover of night, their footsteps quiet but their intentions far from peaceful. As the men approached the church, the sound of their boots on the dirt road was faint but unmistakable to those standing guard outside. The church had stationed a few armed members as lookouts, not out of aggression, but because they knew that union meetings like this had often drawn hostility in the past. The guards could see shapes moving in the darkness, the glint of metal under the faint moonlight. Moments later, words were exchanged tense, sharp, and edged with suspicion. No one can say for certain who fired the first shot, but in an instant the quiet night erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked through the air, echoing across the cotton fields. The church windows rattled, and people inside dove to the floor, clutching their loved ones, hearts pounding with fear. Outside, the brief exchange left one man dead, a white security guard who had come with the group. In the stillness that followed, the reality of what had happened settled over both sides like a suffocating fog. Those in the church knew that this single moment would not be seen in its true complexity. The death of a white man, especially in this racial climate, would ignite something far larger than the small meeting at Hoop Spur. Word of the incident traveled quickly, stripped of its context, twisted into a narrative that painted the black sharecroppers as aggressors. By morning, whispers had become shouts, and shouts became calls for retribution. The local press reported the story in ways that stoked outrage rather than truth, emphasizing the death while ignoring the months of exploitation and intimidation that had led to the meeting in the first place. Across the county, men began arming themselves, gathering in small bands, determined to punish those they believed responsible. Inside the black community, fear mixed with a grim understanding of what was coming. Families began to hide, some fleeing into the dense woods and swamps, hoping to escape what they knew would be a wave of violence. The sharecroppers who had come together in the church for fair pay now found themselves painted as rebels against the established order, their cause buried beneath a tide of anger. The attack on the meeting became the spark for a far larger and bloodier conflict, one that would engulf the region in days of violence. It was a tragic demonstration of how a single event born of deep social inequality and miscommunication could spiral into something catastrophic. At Hoops, the night had begun with quiet determination to seek justice through lawful means. But Barn, the seeds of one of the deadliest racial conflicts in American history had been sown. The church, which had been a place of hope, was now a symbol of danger. Its wooden walls, still standing, carried the echoes of hurried prayers and muffled sobs from that night. Those who survived would remember not only the gunfire, but the look in each other's eyes, the knowledge that what they were fighting for was just, but that justice itself was now slipping further from reach. The death of the security guard would overshadow every truth they tried to tell, every explanation they tried to give, drowned out by the louder voice of vengeance. In the years that followed, survivors would recall that night as a turning point, when the fragile line between peace and bloodshed snapped under the strain of fear and prejudice. Hoop Spur became more than just a location on a map. It became a testament to the volatile intersection of race, labor, and power in America's rural South, a reminder of how quickly hope can be consumed by the flames of misunderstanding and hatred. And for those who were there, the memory would never fade, each retelling a quiet act of resistance against the version of history that tried to erase their truth. As the tension from the incident at Hoop Spur simmered, whispers began to ripple through the small towns and farmlands of Arkansas, crossing over into neighboring Mississippi. These whispers twisted and grew with each telling, morphing into ominous claims that a black uprising was underway. The story spread like a storm on the wind, reaching the ears of those already primed to see danger where there was none, in a climate already heavy with fear, economic strain, and deep divisions. It did not take much for suspicion to harden into certainty. Soon, the falsehood took on a life of its own, fueled by the voices of those eager to believe it, and the papers that repeated it without challenge. In the eyes of many white landowners and townsfolk, this rumor was not just idle talk, it was an alarm bell, a call to action. Men who had never stepped foot in Hoop Spur found themselves swept into a wave of fervor, convinced that they were riding out to defend their homes, their families, and their way of life. Across the flat fields and dusty roads, rifles and shotguns were taken down from above mantles, ammunition boxes were checked, and horses were readied. Some arrived in wagons, others on horseback, and still others in automobiles rattling down dirt tracks, all converging toward the same destination. They came not as a disorganized mob, but as a determined force, their numbers swelling into the thousands. By the time the first groups reached the outskirts of Phillips County, the rumor had metastasized into a story of armed black men plotting to overthrow the local order, an image so far from reality that it bore no resemblance to the truth. But truth no longer mattered. What mattered was the story they had chosen to believe, a story that painted an entire community as an enemy. In that atmosphere, reason was drowned out by the clamor of fear and the rush of adrenaline. Armed patrols moved in through cotton fields and along rail lines, their boots crunching against dry soil, their eyes scanning for movement. Black families, who had been working in the fields or tending to their homes, began to hear the approach of engines, the clip of hooves, the shouts carried on the wind. Many had no idea what was happening until it was too late. The men who had come into their county were not here to ask questions. They had already decided what they believed and what must be done. The violence that followed unfolded with a speed and scale that left no corner of the black community untouched. Some fled into the woods, desperate to find cover among the trees and underbrush. Others tried to hide in barns, churches, or neighboring farms, praying the armed men would pass them by. But the sheer number of vigilantes meant there were few places beyond their reach. Shots rang out over the fields, echoing against the low hills, as the panic and chaos spread. What made this moment so harrowing was not just the brutality itself, but the way it was justified in real time. The men carrying out the violence told themselves and each other that they were acting in self-defense, stopping an imagined rebellion before it could begin. It was a powerful illusion, one that allowed them to commit acts they might otherwise have condemned. They spoke of restoring order, but the order they sought was one built on fear, intimidation, and the suppression of voices calling for fairness. Meanwhile, Those who had attended the union meeting at Hoop Spur just days before, hoping to discuss wages and fair treatment, were now scattered, hunted, or in hiding. Families were torn apart in the chaos, with children separated from parents and loved ones disappearing without a trace. Entire households were upended in a matter of hours, and the cotton fields that had been quiet with the rhythm of labor just days earlier were now littered with signs of struggle-trampled rows, discarded belongings, and the lingering smell of gunpowder. In nearby towns, some white residents watched the flow of armed men pass through without speaking up, unwilling or afraid to challenge what was happening. Others actively joined in, swept up by the fervor of the moment. The roads that had once carried goods to market now carried armed convoys, their purpose as clear as it was grim. This was not a clash of equal forces, nor was it the suppression of any genuine rebellion. It was an onslaught against a community already living under the weight of deep inequality. The rumor that had sparked it all was never proven, never supported by evidence, yet it had been enough to mobilize an overwhelming force and unleash days of terror. In the years that followed, survivors would carry the memories of those hours like an open wound, memories of running barefoot through dark woods, of crouching in silence as strangers passed by just feet away, of watching homes burn and hearing the sharp crack of rifles in the distance. The massacre was not simply a moment of violence. It was a calculated act of control, a message to anyone who dared to organize, to question, or to demand fair treatment. And it was made possible not by facts, but by a story, a lie that spread faster than the truth could hope to catch it. The events that began with a union meeting had now spiraled into a tragedy that would haunt Phillips County for generations. As the violent rumors escalated into full-blown terror, the arrival of state and federal troops marked a devastating turning point in the tragedy that was unfolding across Phillips County. What was supposed to be a protective intervention quickly morphed into a brutal campaign of destruction and fear. These soldiers, armed with the latest weapons of the era, including machine guns, joined forces with the white vigilantes who had already been sweeping through the region, their combined power overwhelming any chance the black community had of survival or safety. The troops came with orders not merely to restore order, but to crush what they and local authorities labeled an insurrection, a term heavy with accusation yet devoid of truth. To the men and women caught in the crossfire, it became clear that this was no impartial law enforcement mission. Instead, it was an indiscriminate hunt, marked by scorched earth tactics that destroyed homes, livelihoods, and lives with cold efficiency. Families who had spent generations building their lives in the fertile Arkansas Delta found their homes engulfed in flames, their possessions turned to ash before their very eyes. Reports from survivors tell of troops advancing through the countryside with machine guns trained on anyone who moved, shooting at men, women, and even children. The cotton fields, once the backdrop of daily labor and hope, became scenes of unimaginable horror. People who tried to flee into the swamps or forests were hunted down, their cries lost amid the crackle of gunfire and the roar of burning timber. It was a reign of terror that lasted for days, with no sanctuary offered to those targeted. Eyewitnesses recalled how entire families were forced from their homes at gunpoint, made to watch helplessly as flames consumed everything they owned. The soldiers were aided by local law enforcement and vigilantes who knew the land intimately and showed no hesitation in participating in the violence. This coalition of power operated with near impunity, emboldened by a social system that had long denied black citizens any real protection under the law. The use of machine guns was particularly chilling, an overwhelming show of force meant to intimidate and decimate. Unlike typical firefights, these were not battles between armed combatants, but mass executions disguised as military action. The thunderous bursts of gunfire echoed through the night, silencing cries and leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. Survivors recounted the sheer terror of hearing those weapons from the edges of the woods where they had sought refuge, knowing that capture could mean torture or death. as the troops methodically burned homes and chased down black residents. The scale of the violence shocked even some within the white community. The deaths numbered in the hundreds, though the exact toll was never officially recorded, a testament to the erasure of black lives from public memory. This absence of accountability was compounded by the media and local officials who spun a narrative casting the victims as criminals rather than innocent people defending their rights. In the days following the assault, those who survived faced further indignities. Hundreds were arrested under charges of insurrection or murder. Despite having been victims themselves of the massacre, their trials were swift and unjust, with coarse confessions and biased judges sealing their fates. This legal persecution underscored the profound imbalance of power that had allowed such violence to occur in the first place. Yet amid this darkness, stories of courage emerged. Some brave individuals attempted to document what had happened, collecting testimonies and evidence in the face of hostility and threats. Activists like Eda Wells took up the cause, traveling to Arkansas to bring national attention to the atrocities, challenging the official version of events and demanding justice for the victims. Their work laid the groundwork for civil rights struggles that would continue throughout the 20th century and beyond. The involvement of state and federal troops in the Elaine Massacre exposed the depths of systemic racism embedded in American institutions. Rather than protecting all citizens equally, these forces had become instruments of oppression, enforcing a racial hierarchy with lethal force. The image of machine guns firing indiscriminately at defenseless families remains a haunting symbol of the era's cruelty. Even now, the legacy of this brutal chapter serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences when power is wielded without justice and when fear is allowed to override humanity. The Elaine Massacre was not simply a tragic event in Arkansas's history, but a stark example of how the fight for civil rights has often been met with violence sanctioned by those in authority. It challenges us to remember, to acknowledge, and to continue striving for a society where such atrocities can never be repeated. The aftermath of the Elaine Massacre revealed a staggering and deeply disturbing disparity in the loss of life that shocked those who dared to look beyond the official accounts. While the violence raged across Phillips County, the death toll climbed steadily, and by the time the smoke cleared, at least 200 African Americans had been killed. Though many historians believe the true number was far higher, in stark contrast, only 5 white individuals lost their lives during the same period, highlighting not only the overwhelming brutality inflicted upon the black community, but also the profound imbalance of power and justice that defined the tragedy. The numbers alone tell a story of disproportionate suffering, but the reality behind those figures is even more harrowing. The African American victims were not combatants in a war but innocent men, women, and children caught in a wave of racial terror. Many were sharecroppers and laborers, people who had gathered peacefully to seek fair wages and better treatment, only to be met with a violent backlash that offered no chance for defense or mercy. Their deaths were not isolated incidents but part of a systematic campaign of fear and control, designed to crush any attempt at black organization or empowerment in the Jim Crow South. Communities were devastated, families shattered, and futures stolen in what can only be described as a massacre rather than a riot. Entire neighborhoods were razed, homes burned to the ground, and survivors left to wander the ruins of their lives amidst the lingering smell of smoke and gunpowder. The scenes bore the marks of cruelty and disregard: men gunned down in the fields, women and children fleeing into the swamps only to be hunted down, bodies left unburied and forgotten. The scale of loss echoed far beyond the immediate region, casting a long shadow over the struggle for racial justice in America. On the other side, the deaths of 5 white individuals, while tragic, paled in comparison and were often used as justification for the overwhelming response by law enforcement and vigilante groups. This imbalance underscored the deeply entrenched racial biases that permeated the legal and social systems, where black lives were deemed expendable and white lives held far greater value. The narrative presented to the public framed the massacre as a defensive action against a supposed black uprising, shifting blame away from the perpetrators and onto the victims themselves. This distortion of truth further victimized those who had already suffered unimaginable losses. As official reports glossed over the violence inflicted on the black community and minimized their humanity, the 5 white deaths became the focal point of the story, overshadowing the hundreds of African Americans killed and the widespread destruction wrought upon their families and communities. Such selective remembrance served to perpetuate the cycle of oppression, allowing the dominant power structure to maintain control through fear and misinformation. Yet, amid the pain and loss, the resilience of the African American community began to shine through. Survivors and their descendants carried the memory of those killed as a solemn testament to the injustices they endured, passing down stories of courage, resistance, and the unwavering desire for dignity. Activists and legal advocates fought to bring attention to the massacre, challenging the official narratives and seeking justice in a system stacked against them. Their efforts, though met with fierce opposition, laid the groundwork for future civil rights advancements and highlighted the importance of truth in healing and reconciliation. The Elaine Massacre stands as a brutal reminder of the costs of racial hatred and the devastating consequences when power is abused to silence and oppress. The disproportionate death toll serves not only as a historical fact, but as a moral indictment of a society that allowed such violence to occur with impunity. It calls upon us to confront the uncomfortable truths of our past and to commit to building a future where equality and justice are not mere ideals but realities for all. Remembering those lost in Elaine is essential not only to honor their lives, but to ensure that their suffering was not in vain. It is through acknowledging the full scope of this tragedy, including the staggering loss of African American lives compared to the few white deaths, that we can begin to understand the depths of systemic racism and the urgent need for ongoing change. The story of Elaine is a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of cruelty and a challenge to all who hear it to never forget, never repeat, and always fight for justice. In the chilling aftermath of the violence that swept through Phillips County, the tragedy deepened with the mass incarceration of hundreds of black residents, many of whom had done nothing more than seek justice and fair treatment through peaceful means. These individuals, already traumatized by the savage attacks on their communities and families, found themselves rounded up and thrown into jail cells under accusations that were as false as they were brutal. The authorities, eager to pin the blame for the unrest on the black community, used every means at their disposal to force confessions, often resorting to horrific methods of torture that left victims broken in body and spirit. The story of those imprisoned is one of profound injustice. Men and women were arrested indiscriminately, many swept up simply because of their race or their association with the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. The union, which had sought to peacefully advocate for better wages and working conditions, became the scapegoat in a cruel charade of law enforcement. The prisoners, confined in overcrowded and squalid jails, endured harsh conditions while their fates were decided not by fair trials, but by a legal system steeped in racial prejudice and designed to uphold white supremacy. Among those jailed were 12 men who became the focus of a particularly grim chapter in the Elaine Massacre. These 12 were accused of murder and insurrection charges that carried the death penalty and faced trials that were anything but just. From the outset, the proceedings were tainted by bias, intimidation, and the looming presence of mobs outside the courthouse that threatened violence if the defendants were not swiftly convicted. The atmosphere was charged with fear and hostility, leaving little room for legal defense or impartial judgment. Under such pressure, many of the accused were coerced into giving false confessions, often extracted through brutal beatings, deprivation, and other forms of torture. These confessions, manufactured under duress, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, painting a distorted picture that fed into the prevailing narrative of a black rebellion that needed to be crushed. The truth that these men were fighting for their basic rights and had been victims of a massacre was buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation. The trials themselves moved with alarming speed, reflecting the urgency felt by local officials to close the case and quell any further unrest. Defense attorneys, including some from the NABE, worked tirelessly to expose the flaws and injustices in the process. But their efforts were often stymied by the entrenched racism of judges and juries who saw the accused not as defendants, but as enemies to be eliminated. The death sentences handed down to the 12 men sent a clear and chilling message. Any challenge to the existing social order would be met with the harshest possible punishment. The plight of these men and the hundreds of others jailed did not go unnoticed. Civil rights activists and journalists, most notably Etta B. Wells, took up their cause, risking their own safety to shine a light on the abuses taking place in Arkansas. Wells traveled to the region, gathering testimonies and documenting the conditions faced by the prisoners. Determined to challenge the distorted narratives and demand justice, her work helped bring national attention to the Elaine Massacre, revealing the stark realities behind the headlines and pushing for legal appeals and intervention. Despite the overwhelming odds, the efforts to fight back against these miscarriages of justice bore some fruit. The case of the 12 men eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which in a landmark decision acknowledged the denial of due process and the prejudicial environment in which the trials had occurred. This ruling, though coming years after the fact, was a crucial step in affirming the rights of Black Americans and setting a precedent against racially motivated legal persecution. Yet the scars of this dark episode lingered. Many of those jailed lost years of their lives to imprisonment. Families were torn apart, and the trauma of torture and injustice left lasting wounds. The Elaine Massacre and the subsequent legal repression revealed the extent to which systems of power would go to maintain racial hierarchies, using violence not only on the streets but within courtrooms and prisons as well. This chapter of history serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience required to fight for justice in the face of overwhelming oppression. It also underscores the importance of vigilance against abuses of power and the need for legal protections that truly guarantee fairness and equality. Remembering the experiences of those hundreds jailed, tortured, and sentenced to death is essential in understanding the full scope of the Elaine Massacre and its place within the broader struggle for civil rights. The courage of those who endured imprisonment and fought for their freedom resonates today, reminding us that justice is not given, it must be demanded and defended. Their story challenges us to confront the injustices of the past and to build a future where such miscarriages of justice can never happen again. The grim saga of the Elaine Massacre took a crucial turn in 1923, 4 years after the tragic events that had shattered Phillips County and devastated its African American community. The case of the 12 men sentenced to death, emblematic of the profound injustices that had unfolded, finally reached the highest court in the United States, the Supreme Court. Their convictions, handed down amid a frenzy of racial hatred, fear, and outright violence, were challenged on the grounds that the trials had been fundamentally unfair, tainted by the very mob mentality that had terrorized the town and fueled the massacre. The journey to this landmark decision was neither quick nor easy. For years, the convicted men languished in prison, their fates sealed by a system more concerned with maintaining white supremacy than delivering justice. Their trials had been held under intense pressure, with armed mobs surrounding the courthouses, intimidating witnesses, jurors, and judges alike. The atmosphere in Phillips County had been hostile, biased, and rife with threats, leaving no possibility for an impartial legal process. The defendants had been denied basic protections, including the right to fair representation and the ability to call witnesses who could testify to their innocence. The Supreme Court, in a rare but powerful rebuke, acknowledged these violations of due process and the undeniable influence of mob rule over the judicial proceedings. The ruling, delivered in 1923, overturned the convictions of the 12 men, marking a historic moment that underscored the critical importance of constitutional protections. Even in the face of deep-seated racism and social upheaval, the decision was not only a personal victory for those men but a broader affirmation that the law must stand above prejudice and violence. This ruling came at a time when the struggle for civil rights was still in its early stages, and victories like this were few and far between. The court's recognition that the mob had effectively controlled the trial process was a stark condemnation of the conditions that allowed racial terror to influence justice. It shone a spotlight on the systemic failures that had let the massacre happen, and had further victimized those who sought only to assert their rights and dignity. For the families and communities affected, the Supreme Court decision was a bittersweet moment. While it brought legal vindication to the men wrongly convicted, it could not erase the years lost to wrongful imprisonment, the pain of separation, or the broader devastation caused by the massacre and its aftermath. Many lives had been irreparably altered, and the wounds inflicted by violence, injustice, and systemic racism would take generations to heal. This pivotal legal victory also energized civil rights activists and organizations like the NAP, who saw in the case of the Elaine 12 a crucial example of the necessity for legal advocacy and national attention to combat racial injustice. The ruling helped set legal precedents that would be invoked in future cases challenging discriminatory practices and unfair trials across the country, slowly but steadily pushing the nation toward greater equality under the law. Yet, even with this triumph, the Elaine Massacre remained a largely forgotten chapter in American history for many years, overshadowed by other events and suppressed by those who preferred silence over accountability. The story of these 12 men and the Supreme Court's intervention is a testament to the resilience of justice, a reminder that the law can serve as a tool for righting wrongs, but only if there are those willing to fight for it. In connecting this critical moment to the broader narrative of the Elaine Massacre, it becomes clear how the forces of violence, oppression, and systemic racism sought to suppress the voices and lives of Black Americans, and how legal intervention, though delayed, can provide a path toward recognition and justice. The Supreme Court's decision to overturn these convictions did not undo the horror of that dark chapter, but it did send a powerful message that due process and fairness must prevail, even in the most challenging and divided times. Reflecting on this moment in history challenges us to remain vigilant in protecting the rights of all individuals, to resist the influence of fear and prejudice on justice, and to honor the courage of those who stood firm in the face of overwhelming odds. The Elaine Massacre and the 1923 Supreme Court ruling together form a narrative of tragedy and hope, injustice and resilience, a story that continues to resonate as we strive for a more just and equitable society. The Elaine Massacre stands as one of the most harrowing and significant episodes in the history of racial violence in the United States, exposing the deep-rooted injustices and systemic oppression that African American communities faced, especially in the Jim Crow South. This tragic event laid bare the extreme lengths to which white supremacist forces would go to maintain control over Black laborers and to suppress any attempts at economic and social empowerment. The massacre did not just mark a violent moment in 1919 Arkansas, it left lasting scars that have echoed through the decades, shaping race relations in the region and the nation as a whole. The brutal killings, the mass arrests, the coerced confessions, and the flawed judicial system all revealed a society struggling with its conscience, trapped in a cycle of hatred and fear that denied basic human rights to an entire community. The Elaine Massacre was more than a violent clash. It was a reflection of a society unwilling to face the inequalities festering beneath its surface. The systemic racism that allowed such an atrocity to occur created a legacy of mistrust and pain that, has lingered in Arkansas for generations. Yet, amid this darkness, the resilience of the Black community and the courage of those who fought for justice remind us of the enduring human spirit. The legal battles that followed, culminating in the Supreme Court's landmark ruling overturning wrongful convictions, demonstrated that progress, although slow and fraught with obstacles, is possible. These moments of resistance and advocacy laid important groundwork for the civil rights movements that would arise decades later, inspiring new generations to continue the fight for equality and dignity. Today, remembering the Elaine Massacre is crucial not only to honor the victims whose lives were tragically cut short, but also to understand the complex history of race and power in America. It calls on all of us to confront uncomfortable truths and to commit ourselves to building a society where justice is truly equal and where the horrors of the past serve as lessons for a more compassionate future. Recognizing the pain and suffering endured by the survivors and their descendants is an act of respect and a step toward healing wounds that remain open. Thank you so much for joining me in exploring this important and painful chapter of history. If you found this story meaningful and want to support efforts to share more untold narratives and deepen understanding of our shared past, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring these eye-opening stories to a wider audience and fosters awareness that can inspire change. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen and reflect on the lessons from the Elaine Massacre. Wishing you all a peaceful night and restful sleep, may we all wake up inspired to work toward justice and equality every day. Good night.